For 11 years they poured money into the river and laughed at the one woman who was brave enough to pick it back up. Every morning, hundreds of liters of pale sour-smelling whey rushed from the local cheese factories into the creek beside Elena Marquez's land. To everyone in the village, it was worthless waste, the dirty liquid left behind after the good part of the milk became cheese. But Elena knew something they didn't. Years earlier, while working at a dairy plant, she had learned that whey was not simply water. Hidden inside that cloudy liquid was protein, valuable nutrition that the cheesemakers were throwing away every single day. So while men like Don Rafael Ortega, the village's biggest cheese producer, mocked her from the roadside, Elena stepped knee-deep into the polluted creek with buckets in her hands. She collected the whey, loaded it into plastic containers and carried it home before it spoiled. "Why are you wasting your time with garbage?" Rafael once asked her. Elena said nothing. Because she wasn't collecting garbage. She was collecting something nobody else had learned how to see. At first she turned the freshest whey into ricotta-style cheese. Then she discovered it could help feed pigs because of the protein it still contained. Slowly the waste began producing food, healthier animals, and income. The villagers had spent years staring at the same white stream and seeing pollution. Elena looked at it and saw opportunity. And one day the very people who had laughed at her would come knocking, asking to buy back what they had thrown away. But the opportunity Elena saw had been born from something far darker. Long before she ever carried the first container of whey home, the creek beside her land had already begun to die. When Elena was a child, Santa Luca Creek had been the heart of the valley. In August she would kick off her shoes and wade into the cool water until it reached her waist. Small fish flashed beneath the surface like silver coins, and in the late afternoons her father Mateo Marquez would bring their cattle down to drink. Back then the creek smelled of wet earth, grass, and summer rain. Then the cheese factories arrived. First 1. Then 4. Then 7. Behind every cheese house a plastic pipe appeared, and from those pipes came a steady stream of cloudy, greenish-white liquid. Day after day, thousands of liters of whey poured directly into Santa Luca Creek. At first no one seemed worried. "It's only leftover milk water," the cheesemakers said. But the creek began changing. The stones grew slippery beneath a layer of gray slime. Yellow foam gathered along the banks. The clean smell disappeared, replaced by something sour and heavy that clung to the throat. Slowly the fish vanished. Then one morning when Elena was 26, she found one of her cows lying motionless beside the water. Its body was swollen. Its mouth was still touching the creek. Elena stood there for a long time, staring at the animal, unable to move. The cow had not died because there was no water. It had died beside a creek full of it. After that, Mateo stopped bringing the cattle down to drink. Some evenings, Elena would find him standing silently at the edge of the property, watching the white water flow past the land he had spent his life protecting. He never complained. He never shouted at the cheesemakers. He simply watched. 2 winters later, Mateo died. And for Elena, the creek became more than polluted water. It became a reminder of everything her family had slowly lost. For months she said nothing. Then she left the valley and found work at a dairy processing plant several hours away. That was where she finally discovered what was really happening. The whey pouring into Santa Luca Creek was not poisonous in the way most people imagined. It did something more deceptive. It fed the water too much. Whey contains organic material, and when enormous amounts enter a stream, microorganisms begin feeding on it. As they multiply, they consume the oxygen dissolved in the water. Little by little, the creek loses the oxygen fish and other aquatic life need to survive. The water does not become empty. It becomes crowded with life, consuming the very air other life depends on. One technical document Elena studied explained the scale of the problem in a way she could never forget. Even a relatively small amount of whey could demand the oxygen contained in a vastly larger quantity of clean water. Back home, the 7 cheese factories were dumping roughly 5,800 liters of whey every single day. One night, Elena sat alone at a small kitchen table and wrote the number on a scrap of paper. 5,800 liters. Every day. She stared at it until the meaning became impossible to ignore. The creek was not dying because the valley had nothing to give it. The creek was dying because people were giving it too much of the wrong thing. And the cruelest part was that what was suffocating the river was not useless at all. It contained protein. It contained nutrients. It contained value. The same liquid that was destroying the creek could feed animals, become food, and perhaps become something even more valuable if someone could collect it before it spoiled. That realization changed Elena completely. She stopped seeing Santa Lucia Creek as only a wound from the past. She began seeing it as a problem that could be solved. And for the first time since her father's death, she knew exactly what she had to do. She would return home. She would stop the whey before it reached the water. And if everyone else insisted on calling it waste, Elena was ready to build her future from their mistake. But Elena's decision to return home was not born from business ambition alone. It came from a memory she had spent years trying not to revisit. Before the pipes, before the foam, before the sour smell settled over the valley, Santa Lucia Creek had been part of her childhood. She remembered summer afternoons when the water ran clear enough to see every stone beneath her feet. Small fish darted between her ankles. Her father Mateo would lead the cattle down the slope at sunset, and the animals would drink without hesitation while he stood nearby with one hand resting on the fence post. To Elena, the creek had once seemed permanent. Like the mountains, like the land, like her father. Then the cheese houses began appearing along the valley. 1 became 3. 3 became 7. And with every new factory came another pipe pointed toward the creek. At first the changes were easy to ignore. The water became cloudy on certain mornings. Then the smell appeared. After that came the foam, yellowish patches gathering along the banks like something sick breathing at the surface. People noticed. But noticing was not the same as stopping it. The cheesemakers called the whey harmless leftovers. The villagers had families to feed, milk to sell, debts to pay. No one wanted trouble with the businesses keeping money moving through the valley, so the pipes kept pouring. And the creek kept changing. The fish disappeared first. Then the cattle began refusing the water. Elena still remembered the morning everything became personal. She was 26 when she walked toward the creek and saw one of their cows lying strangely near the bank. At first she thought the animal was sleeping. Then she saw its swollen belly, its stiff legs, its mouth touching the pale water. Elena ran toward it, dropped to her knees and placed a hand against its neck. Nothing. The cow had not wandered into the desert and died of thirst. It had died beside the water that was supposed to keep it alive. That image followed Elena for years. But what stayed with her even more was what happened afterward. Her father did not storm into the cheese houses. He did not threaten anyone. He did not demand compensation. Mateo was already sick by then, and perhaps he was too tired to fight a battle he believed he could not win. Instead, every evening he walked to the edge of the creek and stood there in silence. Elena would sometimes watch him from the house. He would stare at the white current passing through land his family had depended on for generations. There was something unbearable in the way he looked at it, not with anger but with the quiet grief of a man watching a piece of his life disappear while everyone else pretended nothing was happening. 2 winters later, Mateo died. After the funeral, the creek continued flowing exactly as before. White. Sour. Foaming against the stones. For 6 months, Elena barely spoke about it. She did not file complaints. She did not organize the neighbors. She did not stand in front of the factories demanding justice. She simply lived beside the wound until she could no longer bear looking at it. Then she left. Torin offered her something the valley no longer could distance. She found work in quality control at a dairy processing plant, spending her days weighing samples, checking temperatures, recording numbers, and watching milk move through steel pipes and enormous tanks. At first it was only a job. A way to earn money. A way to keep her hands busy enough that she did not have to think about her father standing beside the creek. But one afternoon Elena noticed something that stopped her cold. The plant was making cheese. The solid curds went one direction. The greenish liquid went another. She recognized that liquid immediately. Whey. But here nobody dumped it outside. Nobody called it useless. Workers pumped it carefully into another tank. Elena stood staring at that tank longer than she should have. For 11 years back home, men had been pouring the same liquid into the creek as though it had no value. Here professionals were saving every liter. And in that moment, the death of one cow, the silence of her father, and the river she had loved as a child suddenly connected to a single question. What if everyone back home had been wrong about the thing they were throwing away? That question would not leave Elena alone. The next morning, she returned to the processing floor earlier than usual. The factory was already alive with sound, the low hum of motors, the metallic clatter of equipment, the rush of liquid moving through pipes polished so clean they reflected the fluorescent lights above. She watched the cheese line more carefully than she ever had before. Milk entered the vats white and whole. Then the enzymes were added. Slowly, the milk separated. The solid curds gathered together, thickening into the part everyone recognized as valuable. Those curds would be pressed, molded, salted, packaged, and eventually sold as cheese. But the rest of the milk did not disappear. It became whey. A pale greenish liquid flowed away from the curds and into another system. Back in Santa Lucia, that was the exact moment when people stopped caring. The cheese was the product. The whey was the waste. But here inside the plant, Elena noticed something completely different. The workers did not open a drain and send it outside. They collected it. They pumped it into stainless steel tanks. They measured it. They recorded it. They treated it like something worth protecting. Elena finally approached one of the senior technicians. Why do we save the whey? The man looked at her as though the answer were obvious. Because there's still protein in it. Elena froze. Protein. One word. That was all it took. For years, the cheesemakers back home had believed that everything useful in milk became cheese. Once the curds were removed, they assumed the remaining liquid was nothing more than dirty water. But milk did not contain only one kind of protein. Some of its proteins formed the curds that became cheese. Others remained dissolved in the liquid. Those proteins did not vanish when the cheese was made. They stayed behind. In the Whey. Elena began reading everything she could find. During breaks, she asked questions. At night, she studied an old technical booklet she had taken from the plant. She read the same pages so many times that the binding weakened and the corners curled beneath her fingers. Slowly, the mystery became simple. The cheesemakers of Santa Luca were not throwing away empty water. They were throwing away nutrition. It was like cooking a pot of beef broth, removing the meat, then dumping the broth because you believed all the nourishment had left with the meat. But the broth still carried flavor. Minerals. Energy. Something useful remained. The Whey was the same. And suddenly, Elena saw the creek from her childhood in an entirely different way. She remembered the white current. The yellow foam. The sour smell rising beneath the afternoon sun. She remembered her father staring silently at the water. All those years, thousands of liters had flowed past their land. And hidden inside every liter was something the village could have used. Food. Animal feed. Protein. Possibly income. The tragedy was no longer only that the Whey had damaged the creek. The tragedy was that people had polluted the water with something valuable simply because they had never bothered to understand it. That realization hurt more than Elena expected. Waste, she began to understand, was sometimes nothing more than ignorance given a name. Back home, men like Rafael Ortega had laughed because they were certain they understood what they were throwing away. Elena no longer shared their certainty. Now, whenever she saw Whey flowing through the factory pipes, she imagined the same liquid pouring into Santa Luca Creek, liter after liter, day after day, year after year. And instead of seeing something useless, she began seeing a river of lost opportunity. She started filling a notebook with numbers. How much Whey came from a certain amount of milk? How quickly it changed? How temperature affected it? What could be recovered from it? What farmers might use it for? The more she learned, the more one thought took hold of her. Maybe she could not restore the years her father had lost watching that creek die. Maybe she could not bring back the cow she had found on the bank. But perhaps she could stop the next 1,000 liters from reaching the water. And then the next 1,000 after that. For the first time, Elena was no longer simply studying dairy production. She was preparing to go home. But Elena was about to discover something even more unsettling. The Whey was not only valuable. It was also the very thing that had been quietly suffocating Santa Luca Creek. One evening after her shift, Elena stayed behind in the small quality control room with the technical booklet open in front of her. Most of the factory had gone silent. The machines had slowed, the stainless steel tanks no longer trembled beneath the pressure of moving milk, and only the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights remained. She turned another page. Then she stopped. The explanation was simple enough to fit into a few paragraphs, but what it meant brought back every image she had tried to forget. Whey did not kill a stream because it was poison. It killed a stream because it fed it too much. Elena read the sentence again. And again. When Whey enters water, the organic material inside it becomes food for microscopic organisms. Those organisms multiply quickly because suddenly there is more food than they could ever consume under normal conditions. And while they feed, they breathe. They consume the oxygen dissolved in the water. At first, nothing dramatic happens. The creek still flows. The surface still reflects the sky. But underneath, the oxygen begins disappearing. Little by little. Hour by hour. Until the fish are left swimming in water that can no longer give them what they need to survive. They do not escape. They cannot. They suffocate inside the very water that is supposed to keep them alive. Elena leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She saw Santa Luca Creek again. Not as it had been when she was a child, clear and cool beneath the sun, but as it was before she left, the stones coated in gray slime, yellow foam trembling along the banks, the current carrying that sour smell through her family's land. For years, she had imagined that something toxic had poisoned the creek. But this was worse in a different way. No one had poured poison into the water. They had poured in too much food. It was like locking dozens of people inside a room with no windows and letting them breathe until there was no air left. The room would still be there. The people would still be surrounded by space. But there would be nothing left to breathe. That was what had happened to the creek. Then Elena found the figure that changed everything. According to the technical information she was studying, even a small amount of Whey could create an enormous oxygen demand in clean water. She grabbed her notebook. Back home, the 7 cheese factories along Santa Lucia Creek were dumping roughly 5,800 liters of Whey every day. She wrote the number down. Wubaling, then underlined it. Once, twice, 3 times. Her hand stopped moving. She imagined all 7 pipes running at the same time. Morning after morning. Year after year. Thousands upon thousands of liters entering the same narrow body of water. Suddenly the death of the fish no longer felt mysterious. Neither did the smell. Neither did the slime. Neither did the cow she had found beside the bank. The creek had not simply become dirty. It had been starved of oxygen. It had been suffocating in silence while everyone in the valley looked at the white liquid and called it harmless waste. That night, Elena returned to her rented room and sat at the kitchen table with the booklet, her notebook, and a single cup of coffee that went cold beside her. She kept staring at the number. 5800 liters a day. And then another thought arrived, a thought so strange that she almost laughed. The same liquid destroying the creek was full of protein. The same substance choking the water could feed animals. Could become food. Could become income. What everyone considered a pollution problem was also a resource being thrown away. Elena finally understood the contradiction. Santa Lucia Creek was not dying because the valley had nothing. It was dying because the valley had something valuable and had never learned what to do with it. She closed the booklet and placed both hands flat on the table. For the first time, her anger felt different. It was no longer helpless. It had direction. If the Whey could be captured before it reached the creek, perhaps the water could breathe again. And if that same Whey could be turned into something useful, perhaps no one would ever want to throw it away again. Elena looked at the notebook one last time. She was no longer asking whether the creek could be saved. She was beginning to ask how. And then Elena discovered the real enemy. It was not the cheesemakers. It was not the lack of money. It was not even the polluted creek. It was the clock. The Whey had value. Yes. It carried protein, nutrients, and possibilities no one in Santa Lucia had ever bothered to see. But none of that mattered if the liquid spoiled before she could use it. Fresh Whey left the cheese vat warm. And from the moment it came out, time began working against her. Within hours, the liquid started turning more acidic. Its smell sharpened. Its usefulness narrowed. After roughly 4 hours, the window for making anything worthwhile from it was almost gone. 4 hours. That was all she had. Elena stared at that number in her notebook as if it were a sentence handed down by a judge. 4 hours to collect it. 4 hours to move it. 4 hours to cool it. 4 hours to turn what everyone called waste into something that could still become food. And suddenly she understood why the people back home had never built a business around Whey. It was not because the Whey was worthless. It was because it disappeared too quickly. Not physically. Economically. A product that loses its value before you can transport it is almost the same as having no product at all. That realization followed Elena through every shift at the dairy plant. She began timing everything. How long after separation the Whey stayed warm. How quickly acidity changed. How much temperature mattered. How far it could travel before becoming unusable. She wrote numbers in the margins of old pages on scraps of paper, even on the backs of receipts. Her co-workers probably thought she was obsessed. Maybe she was. But Elena had spent too many years watching Santa Lucia Creek carry away something useful to accept that too late was an answer. One evening she sat alone in her rented room with a hand-drawn map of the valley spread across the table. She marked the cheese houses. 1 here. Another farther north. 2 near the main road. 3 scattered along the creek. Then she drew lines between them. Routes. Distances. Minutes. If she left before sunrise. If every producer had the Whey ready. If she used smaller containers instead of heavy steel drums. If she checked the temperature before loading. If she could get everything back to the farm before the 4th hour. The problem slowly changed shape. Elena had gone looking for a way to use Whey. What she found was a logistics problem. And that gave her hope. Because logistics could be measured. Routes could be shortened. Containers could be changed. Schedules could be improved. People could be trained. The clock could not be stopped. But perhaps it could be beaten. In March, Elena returned to Santa Lucia with 14000 pesos in savings, a notebook full of calculations, and no guarantee that anyone would take her seriously. On the edge of her property beside the dirt road, she built a crude concrete receiving basin with her own hands. It was ugly. One corner leaked. The surface was rough. She patched the cracks with cement and cloth until it held. Then she visited the local cheesemakers one by one. Her offer was simple. Don't dump your Whey into the creek. Put it here. I'll collect it. Some agreed because it cost them nothing. Some laughed. Rafael Ortega refused completely. I'm not delivering my garbage to anyone, he told her. Elena did not argue. She had learned something important by then. You did not need everyone to believe. You only needed enough people to begin. Every morning, before dawn, Elena and her 17-year-old nephew Lucas drove from cheese house to cheese house carrying rows of 20-liter containers. Not giant drums. Drums were too heavy. A full 200-liter barrel could weigh more than she could lift. So Elena designed the system around what her own hands could carry. At each stop she checked the temperature with a kitchen thermometer she kept in her shirt pocket. If the whey was too warm, she rejected it for food processing and saved it only for animal feed. Lucas once watched her writing temperatures in the notebook while sitting on the truck bumper, her fingers trembling from the cold morning air. "Why do you write down everything?" he asked. Elena looked at the numbers. "Because when you don't measure, you guess." Lucas smiled. "And what has everyone been guessing?" Elena closed the notebook. "That this is worthless." She looked toward the pale containers stacked in the truck. They've been guessing for 11 years. And now, every morning Elena was racing to prove them wrong. Because she finally understood the truth. The business was never only in the whey. The business was in those 4 hours. Starting was far harder than understanding the science. Elena had come home with 14,000 pesos, a battered notebook, and a plan that sounded ridiculous to almost everyone who heard it. She had no factory. No stainless steel tanks. No laboratory. No refrigerated truck. What she had was a patch of dry land beside Santa Lucia Creek, an old pickup, 2 strong hands, and the certainty that thousands of liters of something valuable were being dumped past her property every day. So she began with what she could afford. At the edge of the dirt road beside the fence of her family's land, Elena built a small concrete receiving basin by hand. She mixed the cement herself, shaped the walls with a mason's trowel, and worked beneath the sun until her shoulders burned. It took 11 days. The basin was not beautiful. One corner leaked the first time she filled it. Elena stared at the thin stream escaping through the crack, sighed and patched it with cloth and fresh cement. She was not building something to impress anyone. She was building something that had to work. Then came the harder part. She had to convince the cheesemakers to stop sending their whey into the creek. Elena visited them one by one. Her offer could not have been simpler. "Don't dump it into the water. Give it to me, I'll take it." 4 producers agreed, mostly because it required almost nothing from them. One of them was Tom's Vega, the same man who had once joked loudly about Elena collecting dirty milk water. Even while agreeing, he laughed. "You really want all of it? All of it? For free? 1 for now." Tom shook his head as if he had just met the strangest woman in the valley. "Well then, come take it." Rafael Ortega was different. When Elena approached him, he crossed his arms and looked toward the creek. "My whey is garbage," he said. "And I'll throw my garbage where I've always thrown it." Elena did not beg. She did not argue. She simply nodded. "Then yours won't be part of what I build." Rafael watched her walk away. For the first time he did not laugh. The next morning, Elena and Lucas left the farm at 5:30 before the sun touched the hills. Their pickup carried dozens of empty 20-liter containers. Small containers were slower to fill, but Elena had chosen them for one practical reason: she could lift them. A 200-liter drum full of whey weighed more than she could safely move alone, so she designed the entire collection system around the strength of her own body. That became Elena's way of solving problems. If she could not afford the perfect system, she built one that fit the reality she had. At each cheese house, Lucas held the containers while Elena checked the whey with the kitchen thermometer she kept in her shirt pocket. Temperature mattered. Time mattered. If the liquid was already too warm, it could no longer become the food product she wanted to make. It would be separated for animal feed instead. Nothing was wasted if she could help it. By sunrise the truck was heavy. By 8, Elena's arms ached from lifting container after container. By 9, the road dust had coated their clothes and faces. And every morning they raced to be back before the whey crossed the line between useful and spoiled. There were no Sundays off. No applause. No one standing at the roadside telling Elena she had been right. Mostly there was work. Cold hands before dawn. Gasoline bills. Leaking containers. Sour smells trapped in the truck. And laughter from people who still believed she was hauling garbage. But Elena kept going. Because every container she carried represented 20 liters that had not entered Santa Lucia Creek. 20 liters that had not helped suffocate the water. 20 liters that still had another purpose. One morning Lucas watched his aunt sitting on the truck bumper recording temperatures while her fingers shook from the cold. "You really think this is going to become a business?" he asked. Elena looked toward the rows of pale liquid behind them. "I don't know yet." Lucas frowned. "Then why keep doing it?" Elena closed the notebook. "Because everybody else already decided it was worthless without ever trying." She stood and lifted another container. "I'm going to find out." And that was how her business truly began. Not with investors. Not with a perfect machine. Not even with people believing in her. It began with a woman hauling what everyone else threw away and refusing to laugh with them. If Elena had learned one thing from the dairy plant, it was that instinct was useful, but numbers were harder to argue with. So while everyone else in Santa Lucia watched her truck pass before sunrise and joked about the woman who collected waste, Elena kept records. Every container had a story. What time it was filled. Which cheese house it came from. How warm it was when she arrived. How much whey she collected. How long it took to return to the farm. Which batches were still fresh enough to process. Which ones had already crossed the line and could only be used for animals. At first, Lucas thought the notebook was almost comical. They were already exhausted from lifting dozens of 20-liter containers before breakfast. Their clothes smelled sour by the time the sun came up. Their hands were raw from plastic handles cutting into their fingers. And still Elena stopped at every location to write. One morning, Lucas leaned against the side of the truck while his aunt crouched beside a row of containers, thermometer in one hand, pencil in the other. "Tay, why do you write everything down?" Elena did not answer immediately. She looked at the thermometer. 21 degrees. She wrote it. Then she checked the next container. 22. She wrote that too. Finally she said, "Because if you don't write it down, you're guessing." Lucas smiled. "And what is everyone else guessing?" Elena closed the notebook and looked toward the creek. This is useless." Her voice was quiet. "They've been guessing for 11 years. That sentence stayed with Lucas. And it became the foundation of everything Elena did afterward. She did not want to prove the village wrong with speeches. She wanted to prove it with evidence. Day after day, the notebook filled. Soon Elena could see patterns no one else noticed. Whey collected from one cheese house stayed cooler because the producer finished his morning batch earlier. Another location consistently gave her liquid that was already too warm. A shortcut through a dry field saved 12 minutes. Switching the order of 2 stops prevented nearly 100 liters from spoiling before they reached the farm. 12 minutes. To most people, 12 minutes was nothing. To Elena, 12 minutes could mean the difference between a product and waste. She began adjusting everything. Routes. Departure times. Container placement. Loading order. She even learned which producers needed a reminder the night before so their whey would be ready when she arrived. Slowly the chaos became a system. And the system began to produce results. The freshest whey, the batches that reached the farm before the clock beat her, was heated carefully. As the temperature rose, small white flakes appeared on the surface. Elena watched them gather like tiny clouds. She skimmed them off, strained them through cloth and pressed them gently. Ricotta-style cheese. From something the village had poured into a creek for years. On a good day, from roughly 1,700 liters of whey, Elena recovered only about 14 kilograms. It sounded almost ridiculous. 14 kilograms from an entire truckload of liquid. But Elena did the math. At 38 pesos per kilogram, those 14 kilograms brought in more than 500 pesos. Not a fortune. But real money. Money that came from something people had treated as worthless. The first time she counted a full day's sales, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table with the bills spread in front of her. She did not smile right away. She looked at the money, then at the notebook, then out the window toward Santa Lucia Creek. For years people had watched thousands of liters disappear downstream because nobody had bothered to measure what remained inside them. Elena had not discovered a miracle. She had discovered what careful attention could reveal. And that was more powerful. Because miracles could not be repeated. Numbers could. The next morning she was back on the road before dawn. The thermometer was in her shirt pocket. The notebook was under her arm. Lucas started the truck. And once again, Elena went to collect what everyone else had already decided was worthless. Only now, she had something they did not. Proof. Proof changed everything. Not all at once. Not loudly. But little by little, Elena's strange routine began to produce something the village could no longer dismiss as foolishness. Every morning the freshest whey arrived at the farm before the heat could ruin it. Elena poured it into large metal pots and began heating it slowly. At first the liquid looked almost empty, thin, pale, barely different from water. Then the surface began to change. Tiny white flakes appeared. One by one they rose from the whey and gathered at the top. Elena watched closely, waiting for the exact moment when the fragile curds were ready. She skimmed them carefully, poured them through cloth and let the liquid drain away. What remained was soft, white, delicate, ricotta-style cheese. Food. Something people would pay for. The first time Elena held a finished batch in her hands, she barely moved. For years, the same liquid had flowed through plastic pipes into Santa Lucia Creek. No one had stopped to look at it. No one had asked what was still inside. Now, resting in a simple tray in front of her, was the answer. The yield was painfully small. From nearly 1,700 liters of whey, Elena might recover only around 14 kilograms of cheese on a good day. 14 kilograms. After all the lifting. All the driving. All the early mornings. All the containers. At first glance, the numbers almost seemed insulting. Lucas stared at the trays one afternoon and laughed softly. All that liquid for this? Elena looked at him. This is more than the creek ever paid us. Lucas stopped smiling. She was right. At the Sunday market, Elena placed the cheese in simple trays inside a cooler. There was no fancy label. No colorful sign. No grand story written above the stall. Only fresh cheese made from something everyone else had thrown away. Customers approached carefully at first. Some recognized her. Others recognized the smell. A few knew exactly where the whey had come from. But Elena let the product speak. One woman bought half a kilogram. Then another. Then a restaurant owner asked for more the following week. At 38 pesos per kilogram, a good day could bring Elena more than 500 pesos. It was not enough to make her rich. It was not even enough to make the skeptics disappear. But it was enough to prove something. Waste could become income. One afternoon after the market closed, Elena sat in the driver's seat of the old truck counting the bills in her lap. 532 pesos. She counted them again. Then once more. The amount was small compared with what the big cheesemakers earned. But none of those pesos had existed before. They had been hiding in the whey, hiding in the same pale liquid that had covered the stones of Santa Lucia Creek in slime. Elena pressed the bills flat and slipped them into her notebook. She did not feel victorious. Not yet. She felt relieved. Because belief was expensive when nobody else shared it. Every morning she had spent gasoline. Every container had cost money. Every hour of labor had been a gamble. Now, the gamble had begun to answer back. At the next Sunday market, Tom's Vega walked past her stall. For years he had enjoyed calling her the woman who carried water. This time he slowed down. He looked at the trays of cheese. Then at the customers. Then back at Elena. So people really buy that? They do. Tom's picked up a small package and turned it in his hand. That came from Whey. Yes. My Whey. Some of it. For once he had no joke ready. He paid for half a kilogram and walked away in silence. Elena watched him disappear through the market crowd. She knew the village had not changed its mind yet. But something had shifted. Mockery was becoming curiosity. Curiosity could become questions. And questions could become opportunity. Still, Elena knew the truth waiting for her back at the farm. After every batch of cheese was made, hundreds upon hundreds of liters of liquid remained. She had found a way to recover one valuable part of the whey. But most of it was still left behind. The first door had opened. And behind it was an even bigger problem. Elena looked at the notebook beside her and smiled faintly. She had never been afraid of problems that could be measured. The problem waiting for Elena was enormous. After making her ricotta-style cheese, almost all of the whey was still there. She could turn nearly 1,700 liters into a small amount of cheese, but once the white curds were lifted away, more than 1,600 liters of thin liquid remained. It was too much to ignore. Too much to store. And still too valuable to pour back into Santa Lucia Creek. So Elena searched for another answer. This time the answer was standing inside a pig pen. She began buying thin pigs from nearby farmers for about 280 pesos each, animals nobody considered especially valuable. Most people in the valley fed their pigs mainly corn because it was cheap, familiar and easy to find. But Elena had already learned something they had not. Corn could provide energy. Whey could provide something corn lacked. Protein. She started mixing the leftover whey into the pig's feed. At first she expected only a small difference. Instead, the animals changed quickly. Their bodies filled out. Their backs grew broader. Their legs thickened. They stopped looking like the cheap underfed pigs she had purchased. Elena noticed the change before anyone else did because, as always, she measured. She weighed them. She recorded the numbers. She compared one week with the next. The results surprised even her. Her pigs were gaining around 700 grams a day. The pigs raised in the traditional way around the valley were gaining closer to 450 or 480 grams. That difference might have looked small, written in a notebook. But over weeks it became visible from across a fence. And there was another advantage that mattered even more. The whey cost her almost nothing. She was already collecting it. She had already removed the part she needed for cheese. Instead of paying to dispose of the remaining liquid, she was turning it into animal feed. The waste from one business was becoming the fuel for another. Within 10 months, Elena had 26 pigs. The following year she had 43. And for the first time, the people who had laughed at her were forced to look twice. Tom's Vega noticed before he wanted to admit it. One Sunday at the market he walked past Elena's stall as he had done many times before. But this time he did not joke about the woman carrying dirty water. He stopped. His hands rested on his hips. Elena. She looked up. Endure. He glanced at the trays of cheese, then lowered his voice. My wife says your pigs are bigger than mine. Elena nodded. They are. Tom shifted his weight. He seemed almost embarrassed by the next question. Is it because of the whey? Elena looked at him for a moment. For 2 years he had been giving her his whey. For 2 years he had watched her carry it away. And not once had he asked why she wanted it. Tom's, she said, you've been giving me your whey for 2 years. I know. And you never wondered what I was doing with it. He opened his mouth. Then closed it. The joke never came. He bought half a kilogram of cheese, paid quietly, and walked away without saying goodbye. Elena watched him leave and felt something shift again. The laughter was disappearing. Not because she had argued with anyone. Not because she had demanded respect. But because results were becoming impossible to ignore. That year, between cheese and pigs, Elena brought in nearly 198,000 pesos. It was not a fortune. But it was enough to repair the old truck, fix the well, and buy a second-hand cooler. More importantly, it proved that one discarded stream of whey could create 2 separate sources of income: food for people, feed for animals. And still Elena was not satisfied. Because every afternoon after the cheese had been made and the pigs had eaten all they could, she would stand beside the remaining containers and see the same problem staring back at her. 400 liters. Sometimes 500. Still left. Still ticking toward spoilage. The pigs had helped. But they had not defeated the clock. Elena stood there one evening as the sun turned the creek orange and looked at the pale liquid she still could not save. Then a thought returned to her. If the problem was time, what if she could remove time from the whey completely? The answer was hidden in a page. Elena had read so many times that the paper had begun to soften beneath her fingers. Remove the water. That was the idea. Fresh whey spoiled because it was liquid, warm, unstable, always racing against the clock. But if most of that water could be taken away, what remained could be turned into powder. And powder did not have 4 hours. Powder had months. Maybe even a year. The thought obsessed her. It was the difference between fresh meat and dried meat. One spoiled quickly. The other could survive long after the season that produced it was gone. If Elena could dry the whey, she would no longer have to chase time every morning. She could store value. She could build inventory. She could survive bad weeks. She could wait for buyers instead of begging the clock for mercy. There was only one problem. The machine she needed cost more money than she had ever seen in one place. New drying equipment was far beyond her reach. So Elena began searching for something used. She asked mechanics, dairy workers, equipment dealers, people who knew people who had once worked in factories. Month after month she searched. Nothing. Then 14 months later she heard about an old dairy plant that had shut down in another state. Some of its equipment was sitting in a warehouse. Rusting. Incomplete. Almost forgotten. Elena traveled to see it. The machine did not look like a miracle. It looked tired. Dust covered the metal. 2 important parts were missing. Sections were stained with rust. Anyone else might have seen scrap. Elena saw time. Or rather the chance to defeat it. The price was 214,000 pesos. Elena had only 86,000. She stood beside the machine for a long time, running the numbers in her head. She could walk away. She could keep making cheese. Keep feeding pigs. Keep earning slowly. Keep losing hundreds of liters every afternoon. Or she could gamble everything she had built on a machine that might never work. In the end, Elena mortgaged part of the family land. 40 hectares. Land inherited from her father. Land that had already survived drought, poverty, and years beside a dying creek. That night, Lucas found her in the kitchen washing dishes. He had heard. If this doesn't work, he said quietly, we lose almost half the land. Elena kept washing the plate in her hands. I know. Lucas waited for something more. A promise. A reassurance. A reason not to be afraid. Instead, Elena placed the plate on the rack and looked at him. That land hasn't given us much in 20 years. Lucas said nothing. The creek has been dying beside it. The soil has been drying. We've been losing that land slowly for years without calling it a loss. She wiped her hands on a towel. I would rather risk it on something that might bring it back to life than watch it disappear 1 year at a time. The machine arrived in pieces. For 5 months, Elena's farm looked more like a repair yard than a business. A mechanic named Gabriel Soto came from a nearby town and studied the missing components with calipers and hand-drawn measurements. He fabricated both pieces from scratch. Nothing fit the first time. Or the second. Belts slipped. Pipes leaked. Metal screamed. Motors overheated. More than once, Lucas asked whether they had made a terrible mistake. Elena never answered quickly. She simply went back to work. Then on a Tuesday morning, the machine finally ran the way it was supposed to. Warm whey entered one side. Heat and pressure pulled away the water. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then a pale, cream-colored powder began falling into the collection chamber. Elena reached out with both hands. The powder was fine. Soft. It smelled faintly sweet. Almost like powdered milk. She stared at it in silence. For every 20 liters of whey she could recover a little more than 1 kilogram of powder. By then, Elena was collecting around 4200 liters of whey a day. That meant roughly 210 kilograms of powder daily. For the first time, the whey no longer had to be used immediately. It could wait. Elena filled bag after bag and stacked them in the storage room until the walls seemed to disappear behind them. She had done it. She had removed the water. She had removed the 4-hour deadline. She had taken something temporary and made it last. But as Elena stood among the growing towers of powder, another truth settled heavily over her. She had a machine. She had debt. She had mortgaged land. She had hundreds of bags of product. And she still did not have a single buyer. The buyer did not come quickly. For weeks, Elena walked past the storage room and saw the bags climbing higher against the walls. Cream-colored powder. Row after row. Money she had not yet earned. Debt she could already feel. Every bag represented whey she had saved from spoiling, but until someone agreed to buy it, the powder was only potential. And potential did not make bank payments. Still, Elena kept producing. She had learned something too important to stop now. The liquid whey had once ruled her life with a 4-hour deadline. If she failed to collect it in time, it soured. If she failed to process it in time, its value disappeared. The powder was different. The powder waited. It did not care if the truck broke down. It did not care if the market was closed. It did not care if Elena needed another week to find a customer. For the first time, she could store yesterday's production and sell it tomorrow. She had not simply created a new product. She had changed the meaning of time. Then the rains failed. July passed without a proper storm. August came and the sky remained hard and empty. In September, a brief downpour struck the valley for less than half an hour, darkening the soil just long enough to make people hopeful. Then the heat returned. The grazing fields turned the color of old paper. Water levels dropped. Pastures disappeared. And one by one the cattle began losing weight. The crisis moved through Santa Luca like a slow fire. Cows that had once produced 11 liters of milk a day struggled to give 4. Feed prices exploded. A sack that had cost around 320 pesos rose to nearly 690. Tom's Vega could no longer keep his herd alive. He sold 19 cows at auction for far less than they would have been worth the year before. The animals he had raised with his own hands disappeared into someone else's trucks. His cheese operation closed soon after. Rafael Ortega fought longer. He had been one of the largest producers in the valley, a man who once believed his business was too big to be threatened by anything as small as a dry season. But his milk volume collapsed. Feed costs doubled. He sold dozens of cattle. Then he lost a commercial contract because he could no longer deliver enough cheese. Of the 7 cheese houses that had once poured whey into Santa Luca Creek, 4 shut down that year. Families who had laughed at Elena for collecting waste were now standing beside empty feed troughs watching livestock grow thinner by the day. And yet, on Elena's farm, something was different. Her pigs were still healthy. There was less fresh whey than before because fewer cows were producing milk, but there was still enough to support them. More importantly, inside the storage room sat hundreds of bags of powder made during the previous year when the rain had fallen, when milk production had been high, when the cheese houses had worked at full capacity. The drought could not reach those bags. The grass had died. Fresh milk production had fallen. Cheese output had collapsed. But the powder remained exactly where Elena had stacked it. Dry, stable, waiting. One evening, Lucas opened the storage room door and stared at the rows of bags. Outside, the fields were brown. Inside, the previous year's abundance was still alive in another form. "It's strange," he said. "Everything outside is disappearing." Elena ran her hand across one of the bags. Not everything. She finally understood what the machine had truly given her. It was not just a way to dry whey. It was a way to carry value from one season into another. When there was plenty, she could preserve it. When there was little, she could still have something to sell. Everyone else depended on what the land could produce that week. Elena could sell what the valley had produced months earlier. She had not defeated the drought. She had defeated the clock. And now she understood that sometimes those were the same thing. Then in November, a pickup she did not recognize turned off the dirt road and headed toward her farm. A man stepped out, looked at the storage building, and asked Elena 2 questions. "How much do you have? And then, how often can you deliver?" For months, Elena had been waiting for someone to ask exactly that. The man's name was Daniel Reyes, a buyer for a livestock supplement company in Monterrey. He had heard about Elena through a regional technician and driven hours to see whether the rumors were true. Elena led him toward the storage room. When she opened the door, Daniel stopped. Inside were hundreds of bags stacked nearly to the ceiling. Powder made before the drought. Powder made when the cows were still producing. Powder that had survived while everything outside seemed to collapse. Daniel stood in silence for several seconds. Then he turned to Elena. "I've been looking for someone who can supply me consistently," he said. "Most producers deliver for 1 month and disappear for 2. Elena met his eyes. "I won't disappear." "How can you be so sure?" She looked toward the brown fields beyond the doorway. "Because I don't depend on rain." Daniel frowned. Elena continued. "I depend on someone making cheese. And even in a bad year, someone will still make some. Maybe less. Maybe with fewer cows. But as long as there is whey, I can collect it. And when production is high, I can dry it and store it for the months when production falls." Daniel looked back at the bags. For the first time, someone outside the valley saw what Elena had spent years trying to prove. Not waste. Supply. Not leftovers. Inventory. They signed a contract in December. And suddenly the powder stacked in Elena's storeroom was no longer a gamble. It was a business. But the drought had changed more than Elena's finances. It had changed the people who once laughed at her. Tom's came first. Elena saw him at the livestock auction standing beside a loading pen watching several of his own cows being taken away in another man's truck. He looked older than he had 6 months earlier. Not by years. By exhaustion. Elena walked over. "Tom's He did not turn immediately. "That spotted cow," he said quietly. "My father raised her mother." They stood together without speaking. Then Tom's finally looked at her. "Elena, do you have work, hey?" She studied his face. "What kind wife?" "Anything." His voice was low. "I know milk. I know cheese. That's all I know." Elena paused. "You know milk?" Tom's looked down. "And the other thing?" He knew exactly what she meant. Whey. The thing he had mocked. The thing he had handed over for years without asking why she wanted it. Tom swallowed. "I don't know anything about that." Then he laughed once, but there was no humor in it. 11 years I had a pipe dumping it into the creek. 11 years, Elena. And not once did I ask what it was. Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. "You start Monday." Tom's looked at her. "And bring a thermometer." A few weeks later, Rafael Ortega came to Elena's farm after dark. The largest cheesemaker in the valley. The man who had once refused to give her his garbage. Now he stood outside her fence holding his hat in both hands. Elena found him there while checking one of the pigs. "I lost 42 animals," Rafael said. His voice was rough. "The ones I didn't sell died in the pens. I watched them get thinner every day." Elena said nothing. Sometimes pride needed silence before it could finally speak the truth. Rafael stared at the ground. "I have 90 cows left. Feed is too expensive. I can't keep them alive." He turned the hat slowly between his hands. Then came the words neither of them would ever forget. "I came to buy whey." His voice cracked on the final word. Elena looked at him. 11 years. For 11 years Rafael had poured that same whey into her creek. Now he wanted to pay for it. "I'll sell it to you," Elena said. Rafael lifted his head. "Just like that. Just like that. Same price as everyone else." Then, Elena stepped closer. "But I want one thing. Anything. Remove the pipe." Rafael nodded slowly. "I already did." Elena said nothing. "I took it out 3 weeks ago." And there, under the weak light beside the fence, the drought completed what Elena's arguments never could. The people of Santa Luca no longer saw whey as waste. They had finally learned its value. Only now they had learned it the hard way. What happened after the drought was bigger than Elena had ever imagined when she first stepped into Santa Luca Creek with a bucket in her hands. At first the change was almost invisible. One pipe disappeared. Then another. Then another. Cheesemakers who had spent years sending whey directly into the creek began bringing it to Elena instead. Not because the government threatened them, not because someone arrived with fines, and not because they had suddenly become environmentalists. They stopped dumping it for a simpler reason. The whey was worth more to them delivered than discarded. And once waste acquired a price, nobody wanted to throw it away. Within a few years, the white current that had stained Santa Luca Creek began to fade. The sour smell weakened. The yellow foam disappeared from the banks. Rainwater once again moved across stones that had spent years hidden beneath gray slime. Then, during the third summer after the drought, something happened that brought people running from their houses. A boy was playing near the creek when he saw movement beneath the surface. He reached both hands into the water. A moment later, he lifted out a fish. Small. Barely 15 centimeters long. But alive. He shouted so loudly that neighbors came running. People gathered along the bank, staring at the fish twisting between his wet fingers. Some laughed. Some covered their mouths. Others simply stood there. No one in the village had seen a fish in that creek for nearly 2 decades. Elena arrived after hearing the commotion. She stood at the edge of the crowd and looked at the water. For a moment she was a child again. She could almost see Matteo leading the cattle down the slope, almost hear him calling her name, almost feel the cold current around her ankles. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The creek had answered for her. By then, Elena's operation no longer resembled the cracked concrete basin she had built beside the dirt road. Her plant was receiving around 14600 liters of whey every day from 21 cheese producers across 3 municipalities. 19 people worked there. Tom's Vega was one of them. Every morning he stood at the receiving station with a thermometer tucked into his shirt pocket, checking temperatures and recording numbers exactly as Elena had once done alone. The man who had mocked her for collecting dirty water had become one of the people responsible for protecting every liter. And Rafael Ortega. His story became the strangest of all. Each day he delivered roughly 1,300 liters of whey from his cheese operation. Then he bought hundreds of liters worth back in dried form to feed his cattle. He had become Elena's largest supplier and one of her largest customers at the same time. Now, when he joked about it, Elena sometimes laughed with him. It was a different kind of laughter. Not the laughter of someone looking down on another person. The laughter of someone who had finally understood how wrong he had been. The business that began with 14,000 pesos and an old pickup eventually generated more than 4.2 million pesos in annual revenue. But Elena never measured success only in money. Money could repair trucks, pay salaries, buy machinery, save land from the bank. But money could not explain what it felt like to stand beside Santa Lucia Creek and see clear water moving again. Years earlier, a regional agricultural engineer named Victor Salazar had told Elena that whey required large industrial plants, laboratories, expensive equipment, things someone collecting 20-liter containers could never realistically manage. Later, he began using Elena's story in agricultural training sessions. He always started with the same confession. I told this woman it couldn't be done. Then he would pause. What I didn't understand was that she wasn't asking how to succeed within the limits we already had. She was going to change the limits. That became Elena's real legacy. Everyone had looked at the same way. Everyone had smelled it. Everyone had watched it flow toward the creek. And almost everyone had reached the same conclusion. There goes what is left over. Elena had looked at exactly the same thing and asked a different question. What is still inside it? Protein, animal feed, food, jobs, income, a cleaner creek, a second chance for land everyone had given up on. Years later, Elena would still say that she had never discovered anything magical. She had only paid attention to something everyone else had stopped seeing. Because waste is rarely just waste. Sometimes it is simply value that nobody has claimed yet. And perhaps that was the greatest thing Elena ever built. Not the processing plant. Not the business. Not even the system that turned thousands of liters of discarded whey into something valuable. What she truly built was a new way of seeing. For years, everyone in the valley looked at the same white liquid and saw the end of something, the leftover part, the useless part, the part that should be thrown away. Elena looked at it and saw a beginning. That is the lesson worth carrying beyond Santa Lucia Creek. In life, some of the greatest opportunities arrive disguised as rejection, failure, inconvenience, or waste. The world is often quick to label something worthless simply because no one has discovered how to use it yet. Sometimes, what changes your life is not finding something new. Sometimes, it is learning to look differently at what has been in front of you all along. Elena could not bring back the years her father spent watching the creek die. She could not undo every mistake that came before her. But she could decide what happened next. And so can we. When others laugh at your idea, measure it. When they call it impossible, study it. When they throw something away, ask what they failed to see. Because one person's waste may become another person's future. If this story gave you something to think about, tell me in the comments. What is one thing in your life that others overlooked but you still believe has value? And if you want more powerful stories about resilience, courage, and seeing opportunity where others see nothing, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next story.